Hi, Internet. My name's Robyn Haddow. I am a freelance motion graphic artist and designer. I have been working in future tech, fantasy user interface, and film and TV since about 2012, and have worked on somewhere around 50 different TV and feature films, or combined, a bunch of projects. So I'm going on a PC. We're going rogue right now, so bear with me when my hotkey habits make me stumble. But we're going to play my reel and take a look at some of the work. Thank you. Thanks very much, guys. So that is just a selection of some of the projects that I've been involved in from the past 7 or so years. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today, my presentation I call Scans, and Holograms. And it is a series of simple techniques combined. And what I want to take you through are a series of simple MoGraph builds that once you have your build set up, you can easily duplicate and or copy your system and add subtle variation within each MoGraph setup to build what then translates to visual complexity quite simply. So let's take a look. The first exercise we will walk through is going to be the building of a hologram. And I love Guardians of the Galaxy. I'm sure a lot of you guys out there do too. So this is a piece of fan art that I have created, inspired from the NovaCorp's headquarters. You can see the holo table in the foreground of this image from the movie here. And what I wanted to create was a futuristic communications device where the soldiers in the home base headquarters could communicate with all of the ships in the field. So what you see here is a custom shape that I've extruded into Cinema 4D, being the NovaCorp's logo. And I have added some interior structure to the design with an atom array. And I've used the Voronoi fracture for some spline-based matrix-driven animation, and some telemetry splines at the base of our NovaCorp's mark, alongside some nice-looking frequency communication scan lines. So let's take a look first at how we can bring a custom shape into Cinema 4D. So I took the NovaCorp's logo and did a quick trace. You can see this right here. Just did a quick trace inside of Illustrator. And what we're going to do is save out Illustrator 8 file and bring in our spline into Cinema 4D. So because Illustrator and Cinema obviously have different world coordinate system, we can hit H to frame up our spline. And I'm quickly just going to call this front. And what I'm going to do is add some depth in our z-axis. And instead of just duplicating my spline, I'm going to use an instance and label this back, because every change that I make to the front of my spline will ripple into the back spline as well. So I'm going to be using a loft NURB to create our geometry over our splines. And I always like to pull out my Reset PSR button here in my layout, which you can customize, and a null button as well, because those are two keys that I use very frequently. So we can see here, and I'll just filter my grid. We can see here that the outline of my logo is not exactly looking true to the shape of which we outlined. And if I hit NB, you can see our mesh. And I'll just take down some of the subdivisions that I have created on here to make a few less polys. And now the reason why I didn't just throw this into an extrude object is because I wanted to command click on a Mac to copy. We'll use Control here on a PC to duplicate our spline. And we'll be cognizant of the order in which we layer or stack our splines, because the loft NURBS reads everything in a hierarchy. So I'm just going to scale down, Control Z that, scale down my point here. And I'm just going to eyeball where I'd like to place the center point of my star. So you can see here that it's creating a rounding effect, which in this case I want to make a more linear interpolation between my splines. And I'm also going to take the Phong angle off of my geometry to keep that hard edge. And so in the same fashion that I made instances of my main spline, I'm going to create a back point as well, so that any of the changes that I make to the front point will ripple again into the back point of my star. So now you can see that we have a nice geometric design, or extrude it into our shape. And what I wanted to do is, once I saw this, is I created a series of nice Fresnel textures to create nice set of transparency. So I'll just go in here and copy my pre-made shaders to save some time, and I'll show you what one of them looks like. So you can see my Fresnel I just placed in the transparency channel, and it's a nice white to off-white gradient as well. I duplicated that into the luminance and the color channel. So if I place this onto my loft, we can see that I've got the nice transparency, and I'll give you a quick render preview here. And right away, I wanted to bring some dimensionality into my render, and I could do that quite quickly with some ambient occlusion. I'm going to turn my maximum ray length down in order to create a more shallow shadow cast, and try to influence it with a nice tone that will end up being in my final render. So now you can see we're starting to get the nice detail in the contours of my corners, and we so lovely have access to this front point of our star. I wanted to bring out attention to that, and I call these like hero splines that you can color differently or make different thicknesses and add different weights to your piece. And so I'm just going to place these into a sweeteners. So you can see that I will have an extra line weight and a bit of detail. We'll pull this down to like 0.5. or maybe even smaller here, 0.2. The scale is a little bit different, and we'll just hug that hot luminance there. You can see I'm calling out attention and focus to the front point of our star. I'll copy with Control, and I'll scale this up into Z space here, and we are going to just delete the front and the back point. And I'm going to customize the edge, inset a little bit by hand, and I will do that again for the third one in order to add some nice complexity to what we have happening. And as well, I'm going to show you the new caps, how easy it is to play with different spline profiles on the new caps and bevel system. So I'll just pull this one in a little bit here, and I pre-made my different color textures using the same Fresnel shader to keep our transparency. And I'll give a quick render preview here. And I'll turn my ambient occlusion back on in this scene, down to 50, and we'll put a nice bit of blue. And let's give a quick render. And here we have the nice shading that's developing the form of our main piece of geometry. So like I mentioned, the new caps and bevel system here comes with a whole bunch of presets that are just serious fun to play with. So be mindful of the time that you get carried away with playing with different spline types. I really like this multi-linear step looking one. And so that just turns out to be a lot of fun. I made an atom array. I duplicated the inner one to put some bones into our thing, because the thing with holograms is they always look more interesting when you can see through the exterior shape and see the guts. So next I'm going to be taking you through this comms element that lived at the base of our hologram. And this was a really fun, interesting exercise to figure out how to build. And I came across a neat workflow that I am going to show you now. So I'll just open up my reference file in case we need it, and I'll show you the playback here once again so you can see it in software. And I'm going to make a new scene file and drop a spline up on its z-axis into our scene. We'll bring our grid back just for a point of reference. And what we're going to do right off the bat is make it mographable. And we're going to place our circle spline into our cloner object, remove any of the parameters that we have set for it, and I'm just going to shift select all the parameters that I want to affect and hit Control onto my keyboard so they all get affected at once, and create a whole bunch of different splines. And so how we're going to affect the displacement of our splines is using poly effects. Nest our poly effects into to as a child of our spline, and how we're going to drive the displacement is with a shader effector. And the shader effector has access to the beautiful C4D noise, and I'm going to remove the scale parameter, and we're going to drive this a little bit up into the y-axis. And so we'll go back to our shader noise and add some animation speed to our scene, and a couple more frames here so we have a little bit more to see. And right away, you can see that the displacement's working. However, the displacement is affecting the spline in its entirety and not broken up into its spline points, which is the effect that I am after. And so in our poly effects effector, we have our partial poly splines mode, which, as you can see now, opens up access to the number of points and the spline that we're going to be using. So I'm going to make a sphere fall off so we have control of where the displacement is being driven. And I'll throw a sphere field into our scene and crank up the fall off. And what I'm going to do is enter the remapping tab of a spherical field. You can control the contour. And so if we look into the contour mode and take a look at our curves, here we have one of these nice spline graphs that if you hold down Control on a PC, it's Command on a Mac, you can affect how the fall off, where and the degree in which the spline, where I guess the noise is affecting the spline based off of the black and white values in your shader effector. So because I still see there's some fragments that are broken up, I'll go into my shader effector and add a little bit more contrast and some brightness here so we can control the clip a little bit. Maybe we want to turn it down, max that up a bit, and then I'm going to add some more points onto our circle, something like 500. I will tell you that this slows down the scene quite a bit, the more points that you add. So what if we also, I'll see if I can get away with doing like 100 here. That shouldn't be a problem. And I'll go into my shader effector and scale up my noise. Let's say put that at like 500 so it doesn't interrupt the breakup of the partial polys as much. So that's super cool, and quick way to render that. I like to use the hair renderer, and I'm just trying to create a new hair material, and we'll throw this onto our cloner object and right-click and get a render. Right-click and get a render hair tab to have access to the hair renderer. And I'm going to skinny this up. We'll go into the default thickness is always a little bit thicker than what I'm after, 0.5, 0.5. And let's get a nice cyan blue because we're dealing with holograms here. And I'll just make it a solid color and try to do a quick render preview. And whoops, put that down there onto our circle spline, do a quick render preview, and we have our hair, but none of the displacement shows up. So the solution for a lot of things when stuff like this appears is the connect object. So I'm going to hold down Control, and that's not the right one for this thing. I'm going to put my connect object as a parent of my circle spline, and now when I hit render, you can see the displacement. So I thought that was pretty cool, robust. We'll take a look at the playback here really quick. Nice, robust setup. Next, I'm going to show you how I built the telemetry splines at the base of our comms device. And I really like how we have contrasting animation and a slight curve to the geometry that ended up being wrapped around our spline. Let's take a look at this and how I built, we'll play this scene file. How I ended up building this was using the spline wrap deformer, MoGraph fracture object, and time. So again, we're going to open up a new scene file and start with a circle spline. And we're going to need to throw in a plane to get some geometry up on the z-axis. And I always like to see what sort of poly count or faces I'm visually looking at. And right away, I know I'm going to want to make this MoGraphable. So I'll drop it into a cloner and throw my plane into there and take the Y parameter off and a large value into X. We'll throw my plane into a cloner, and we're going to be using a spline wrap to wrap the planes around. So let's nest everything in one system so we have one point of reference. So we're going to be throwing my spline wrap into my circle spline. And now you can see that the geometry, I've added enough faces in the width along my circle spline. And we're going to go into the mode and say keep length. So it keeps the length of our original piece of geometry. That was pretty cool. I thought that, of course, we're going to need to add animation. And so we'll need to, because of order of operations and hierarchy, we're going to be needing to put this unit into its own self-contained system as well. And we'll just call this like base. And this base, we're going to throw it into a fracture object, because we're not going to be doing a cloner right off the bat, and I'll show you why. And we are going to be using, we just need it in straight mode actually, but we're going to be using time, a MoGraph effector time for the rotation time. And by default, the rotation heading parameter is enabled. And now you see, let's give ourselves a few more frames to work with here. Now you see I've got the rotation happening in my scene. I'll just turn that down. And what's missing is that nice little contoured angle that you can have access to within your spline wrap on your geometry. If you twirl down into the spline wrap object tab in the rotation, you have access to some banking. And I'll just put 30 degrees. And once again, I'm just going to Alt-G. You can nest your system into one base root. We'll call this 1. And I'm going to duplicate this instead of using a cloner at this point, because I want to affect the parameters. I'll scale this unit down, and I would like to affect the parameters and the time rotation in the opposite direction. And let's double this speed, like, I don't know, let's say minus 76 or something random for right now. And now that I have this system built up, I can even change, I don't copy, I can even change how, scale that down, the sizes of which it's now, like you can create different geometry. I could even throw a sphere, for example, to be dramatic about displaying difference into this cloner object, and I have access to dropping different pieces of geometry along that. And we'll keep that one for the middle to be the piece that is different. One of these things is not like the other, and I'll put the cloner object to duplicate our base. So we have the very last one in the base. We'll throw this one down, put that minus 100 and see what that gives us. And we're just going to want to have 2 clones here. And we can, let's try 60, hold down Control. And, oh, I need a bit more, let's say, I don't know, 300. There. And then I'll move up my cloner because that's at world 0. And you can see that I'm starting to create a system that I can modify and that I can add a few different parameters to make something similar but different in very few steps. So that is how I made the telemetry splines at the base. And the next thing that we're going to take a look at is some scanning techniques. And so I thought that this, when I was coming up with ideas about how you can, I wanted to scan geometry along a surface. And it was a really interesting sort of bit of discovery. And while I didn't think that this technique was going to fit with the end design conceptually, the technique was super cool, and so I wanted to share that with you. Even though I didn't end up using it in the final build, it was an exploration that I thought maybe you want to tuck away and use yourself for something where it was deemed appropriate. And so how I started developing or coming up with an idea to scan the geometry was I used a landscape object. Oops, I'll make a new scene file here. I can add quite a lot of ridges and hit H to frame our object. That's quite a bit. And we're going to, again, grab a circle spline. Everything, sort of the world is a circle. Let's throw that in our XZ axis. And it's at our world 0. So I'll just drag this up so you guys can see it. And we're going to, again, sweep similar to how we did in our Nova Corps Hero Sweep, some geometry on our circle spline. And so I'll grab a sweep object and nest our 2 circle splines into our sweep. And how I'm going to, where's that one? Wrap the geometry on my landscape object is using a surface deformer. And this surface deformer was so cool. So I'll show you, with my surface deformer active, I'm going to drop my landscape object into the surface deformer and change my projection mode from projecting to mapping. And now you can see how the geometry snaps right to the surface. And I'm going to add, I don't know, a whole bunch of points, let's say 60, so we can get more values to deform along our spline. And I'll just make this a little bit bigger here, and so you guys can see display color. Let's put this like something like, I don't know, red. So you can, oh, I should have done that on the sweep. There we go. And display color on. So you can see how this line is being mapped to our geometry. And there also is an offset that I can add, like maybe a 1, right? Like I think this is so cool looking. And so how are we going to get that scan animation? And I noticed the scale parameter in the surface deformer. So we'll just drop a keyframe, go ahead like 30 frames, and just go to 1. Because the moment you go beyond the 1 value, it breaks. It goes beyond your surface. Well, I'll just show you, and it kind of hinks up. It's because it's constrained to the surface, so it's folding back in and of itself. So I use the limit of 1. And in order to have it disappear, I'll use a Cinema 4D render tag. I'm going to use visibility. So I'm going to get a render display tag, and on 30, we'll enable our visibility. We'll keyframe that from 100 to 0. So now when I play this back, we have one scan that like washes over the whole surface of our landscape and disappears. So I thought this was super cool. And like anything that's super cool that you discover, what do? You want to make lots of. So I'm going to throw that into a cloner object. And okay, again, we see that nothing's happening, right? Like our cloner object isn't working. This parameter, nothing's showing. And that is because we're going to put all of our elements, we'll nest it under a connect object. Again, and that solves, or the connect object lets the cloner know we're going to look at all of these things together as one unit. Let's just see if we can see that. Say 6. My cloner is in Y. There we go. Okay, so that now we know it's working, basically, is what I want to show you. But I'm going to disable that Y parameter. And how we're going to sequence out the animation is using a step effector. And the step effector is super cool because you have access to PSR parameters, which I think at this point, I don't know, let's scale it down to like minus 1.2. Let's just try that because I want to show you some variation through the series of splines. But what most interestingly I like about it here is this time offset. And the time offset, as you can see, will be super dramatic here. I'll put like 60 frames. And when I play out, let's give ourselves some more frames to work with on our animation. When I play it out, we now have a sequencing of our however many cloners that we have in our input field, like 6. So there's a relationship between the math in which you want to do, so like, and your time offset, there's like, say, 3, and you know, I did my keyframes conveniently on 30 on the 30 frames, so we're working in tens. And my time offset here is on 60 frames. So you can see like it's like a layman's sprite or particle. Each thing is being born in a way 30, 60, right? So you understand how you can control your timing. Just wanted to share that with you. And I love this. I think this is so cool. I want to try this effect a lot more on a whole bunch of other things. So, and you can see I have the scale, the -1 scale. So over time, not only are we birthing new scans, each one is rippling down and affecting in the scale. It's kind of like a better version of radio waves because it's got 3D. However, like I mentioned to you, I didn't find it appropriate for the element that we have in mind. And so what do you do in times of trouble is you turn to your friends. And I recently took part in the 3D motion tour and saw this awesome technique that Perception came up with using a Voronoi fracture and spline-based animation in the matrix object. I want to do that too. So as you can see, I walked through the process. I'm going to show that to you in a minute. But in doing so, it really flattened out the dimensionality of that we've worked so hard to make. Like the loft nerve and the point, that was all gone. So when I was playing around with the Voronoi fracture, I discovered the invert feature and made a really hot Fresnel. And I'll show it to you. And I scaled up the asset. So now we're bringing back and maintaining our volume. So let's take a look and see how that is. So I made a NovaCorp's proxy. I'll just copy and paste that into a new scene file. And so all I did was I right-click here and to make a solid piece of geometry, current state to object to bake all of our deformers and connect objects and delete. And I scaled this up just a little bit so it would act like more like a shell, an outer layer on top of our main holographic asset. So we're going to go into, I like to use this end side here, and we'll take our sides down to 2. And let's just turn this down so we can see it a bit. And I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees so we have our spline in a vertical orientation. And we are going to be using the matrix object. And the matrix object has all of the functionality that a cloner object does, but it's way lighter. It doesn't occupy any, it doesn't bog down your scene. However, if I do Control R to render, there's nothing there. And that is because all of the cubes in the matrix object are like referential containers, and they hold spatial data, which is super handy when you're wanting to dev things out and you have a lot of objects in your scene, for example. So I'm going to turn this into object mode and drop my end spline or my end side into the object. And as you know, this loop feature is automatically turned on now, which I like. But what I love about working with splines in cloner objects is it opens up a whole animation tool set. So I'll put a rate value of about 12%, and also with your count, there's a relationship. Your frame length, your count, and your speed, you can do the math and create a loop. So when looking at this, it's going the wrong direction. We're going to want I thought it would be nice to keep with the flow of the design and have our animation go up. And now we're going to place my NovaCorp's proxy inside a Voronoi fracture. And the Voronoi fracture automatically we'll just disable the matrix from our render view because we don't need to see the spacing. It automatically gives you a point-generated source. So we'll look into our Sources tab, and we're just going to delete that because we want to use the matrix, the spatial data of the matrix, because that's doing the animation that we want. So now we will we'll put our matrix object into our sources, and you can see no longer are we doing the random points generation. We're using the spatial data from where my matrices were animating along the spline. So I'll go back into my Voronoi object. I'll just turn off colorized fragments because we don't need to see that for the moment, and add some offset to my fragments here. And so now you can see the spacing. And again, like I just showed you the final render, and I thought that, wow, this is super cool. When I'm spinning around here, I can, we keep the depth, but I was losing the depth in final comp when I was looking at my thing, or when I was looking at the final asset. And so when I inverted it, I thought, wow, this is actually even more mesmerizing. And we can also add the translucent material to it and see the original form of our the main device of the hologram. So that is the Voronoi fracture and using spline, matrix and spline-based animation. And next, I want to take a look at this wrap shader, where I had a subtle background element with, I would even say not secondary, it was like a third level of animation, just to, again, make reference to the environment of our hologram. And I like to continually try to bring back more elements to point to the different layers in space. And I wanted to create this sort of wrap, this overarching hex wrap around our asset. Okay, we'll open up a new scene file, and I used a hexagon spline, an end side, and I'll scale that down, and I just extruded my spline. And I'm going to make this mographable into a, cloner object. And we'll put my extrude in my cloner object and make I use the honeycomb array. Actually, I'll hit H to frame up my whole grid. Here you can control the width and height of your element. And you can also increase or decrease the number of the pieces of geometry that you have within your honeycomb array. So I'll start with that for the time being, and how I used, we'll just have a point of reference here. Let's throw in a cube, and I'll scale that up. And how I ended up wrapping my hex grid around my object was using a wrap deformer. And so I'll add a wrap deformer into our scene and make a system in a null object. So we'll isolate my honeycomb array and my wrap under one null, and we'll take my wrap to a width and height radius of, let's try like 800. We want this to be, oh, pardon me, there's a radius 800. We want this to be bigger than my square. And I'm going to scale down my whole unit here so we can, so I can just emphasize how the wrap is working. And I'm going to rotate the heading. Oh, I want to do it of my whole system, so I'll do that on the null of my, hold down Shift to constrain the axes, and we'll do that on 180 degrees. And I'm going to move my wrap back in Z-space so you can see how it is hugging the object. So I'll just emphasize this here, iron that out a little bit so you can see my hexagon grid, and I'll scale down my cube a little bit so it's not so visually distracting. And how I got the animation into my hex grid was using a shader effector. So I'm going to throw a shader effector in my scene, and again we're going to go into the procedural noise inside of Cinema and crank up the contrast here, and we're going to be using the scale parameter. So I'll put that into -1 because I don't want to have them all, and I'll use the X-ray thing of the cube so we can see a little bit more our hex grid. And so now you can see how we have various sized hexagons in our grid. There's no animation, so I'll go back into my shader effector and add some animation speed to our noise. And here we have some the nice subtle scaling in and out. And I would like to, maybe the clip, you know, you can affect the brightness again so you can see how many are visible. I kind of want to turn off some of them because I didn't want to have so many. Let's use 125 seconds, and we'll do a loop. Make one cycle here. And we'll turn down the animation speed. You can see everything has a relationship in terms of speed and values, 0.2. And so now we have a loop happening. I'll even maybe create like a little red texture here that we can put on our cloner. So and we'll turn off our wrap so you can kind of see, maybe NB, see our wireframes. And maybe I'll even turn off the let's exaggerate our hex a bit so you can see how the animation is turning on and off over time. So I thought that was kind of a nice subtle element to have in the background that encompasses and wraps our main graphic. And the next thing I have here is the reveal. I did a reveal of our, again, we're getting into hexagons, a hex sphere. And I really liked this effect because it sort of was the anticipation of the build-on of our hologram. And this one is an interesting technique to change the topology, basically, of your sphere. And building hex spheres. I made a little file to help me remember it because there's a series of steps that I know that if you miss one, it doesn't work. And so basically, depending on the time of morning that I have to do this, it is more effective than others. But I have my helper, so I'm going to just quickly demo it here with you now. And essentially, we want to translate a point selection from an edge mode to a point mode to get our hexagon shape. So we'll use an icosahedron, and let's add some more segments to our scene. We're going to make that editable, and then we're going to go into edge mode and select all of our edges and go into our mesh, add subdivide palette, and ensure that the smooth subdivisions is on, and select OK. And so now you can see that it translated translated my selection into the point data, and we'll hold down Shift to access it. And it transferred the selection to my point mode, and then we'll go back into edge mode, and we're going to want to melt the edges, which is the hotkey UZ. And so now you can see that the point selection that I had has translated to the edge mode, and there we have our hexagon shape on the topology of our sphere. So that is super cool. And what I wanted to do now was affect the size of the face of my hex sphere. And so we'll go back into face mode and select all. And I'm going to use mesh extrude inner. And what I want to ensure is that my preserve groups is unchecked here, so I can, I can affect the individual size. Wow, that's super sensitive. The individual size. Oh no, lockout. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Go to your input devices, the second one on the top left.
Yeah.
And turn on graphics tablet right there.
Hero, Carlo, thank you very much. There we go. Carlo. Woohoo! All right, now we're not getting those crazy values. So there I can scale down my selection, and we'll UI to access the invert and delete that. And now we have my sphere with the nice topology that I'd like to work with. So I'm going to put this into a fracture object so we can make it MoGraphable. And I'm going to use my favorite effector, which is the plane effector. And we're going to go into our fracture object and take it from edge or from straight mode to explode segments. And I would like to affect it, on the parameter I would like to affect is the scale. And because I want to bring these in from a reveal. And I'm going to use a spherical, or no, do you know what? I'm going to use a cone because I liked the angle in which the cone field, I liked the controls because you had some inner and outer controls of the cone. So let's get into that. And so I'll scale up my cone field and bring this down in, so you can see, now you're starting to see how I created this effect. And there's also, within the cone field, in the remapping tab, some inner strength, or inner offset, as it were, and the outer strength. And so in the end, over time, I animated the inner offset and the strength. I'll show you that I have that here, hex reveal. I animated these. I'll just keyframe them so you can see how the reveal is subtly bringing in it's like a nice dot, it comes in as a nice dot, and then we'll bring in a nice finish of our hex polys. And that was just sort of like the anticipation of, ooh, the comms device is coming or building in. I really like that. So let's take a look at our element one more time. And also here's a full scene. You can see it all put together inside of Cinema. Play that back. And in order to get the source lighting, I used a volumetric light at the base, volumetric spotlight. See if I filter. Oh, I can't affect all of them, but anyhow, then I brought in all my separate scene files and put them all into the same scene, so we have all of the elements interacting together in one space, one environment. I also like to add some toruses into sliced toruses into my scene for environment. So again, we're bringing back the 3D-ness or the 3D nature of our space. And again, some extra added little telemetry bits just for detail. So like most things in this business, we come up with some alts. And I'll play for you the final element build that I have here. Play that out in Premiere. And like most things, everybody wants to have a couple color versions. So I'll drop that one into my timeline as well. We'll just sequence this because I don't know how to isolate this off the top of my head. And I'll press Control-tilde and play out. And you'll see that I've got a nice blue version and a nice fiery, hot amber red with some really cool pinks and purples. And so once you bring all these elements into After Effects, how I composited it on different layers and object buffers, it can open up access to easily colorize and make different versions of your renders. Actually, so I thought like right out of the bag using Cinema 4D's like native renderer, I thought it looked pretty good. So I dialed it to something like this inside of Cinema. So I thought that got us a lot of the way there. So I'm not too sure how much time we have, but I'll keep going until somebody cuts me off. But I thought we could take a look at this scanner that I did for this TV show called Twilight Zone, and it was an airport scanner. We're talking about scans, and holograms. So this scan I thought was super cool, and I can't wait to show you the 3D asset that I have here, because I ended up having to go to Poser because you have access to a whole bunch of different body types where you can use sliders for the belly and the legs and all the muscles and beautiful chubbiness features and clothing, even where you can dress all different types of bodies. And so I then turned to C4D's volume builder and volume mesher to bring in our, draw in our body in a newer way. This was the Twilight Zone. We're new technology, and we didn't just want to take a picture. We wanted to have three-dimensional, a three-dimensional build-in. So as you can see here, what I did in my volume builder, using the fog, I animated the voxel size from super large to pretty small alongside the voxel range in my mesher, and had the volume system draw on the body over time. So I'm going to take a quick copy of my Ryan model and open up a new scene and paste and just show you the guts of my skeleton. Because like most things, the holograms, like you want to have some structure or something on the interior that you're taking a peek at. So it's not just like a translucent, big, gigantic sphere or cube. There's an inner structure that we get to do like a peekaboo look into. And so, I mean, this was so awesome to be able to pose my asset. Because this is the motion when you go through the airport. It's not the T-pose. And then I was able to skin it and export it and bring it pretty seamlessly into Cinema and make a variety of different shaders with different degrees of, using Fresnel to make different degrees of translucency. And I'll just hit render. You can see that I've got, there's all kinds of geometry that I can, again, use the visibility tags to push and pull different parts of the body that I want more prominent. There we go. Okay, moving on. Let's take another look at a body scan that I made for a pilot, and that was using the Sketch and Tune shader with the contours. I did a combination of a points pass, playing with different axes of using contours in Sketch and Tune, and just blending these and offsetting the blend inside of After Effects. This was for a TV show where the characters got scanned and then were ingested inside a VR game. And lastly, I wanted to show you a facial recognition. This was, there was a scene in The Good Doctor where the main character had she had an accident with a weapon on her face, and she needed to go and get the nose reconstructed. So I used, again, same techniques that we did in the hologram build, was poly effects and a plane effector to wipe on the front topology of our face. And that's even just using the Fred, in the content browser, using Fred, the model, the human that Cinema ships with, to disrupt the front face geometry to create the scan effect. So I thought that was like a pretty neat looking effect, and I just played around with Plexus to add a triangulated mesh and some numbers, tag some numbers and data to it to make it look like a more high-tech computer interface system. Oop, that's full screen. So scans, and holograms. That is my presentation that I have for you today. Had one more, but I'm not sure where it is. So anyhow, go PC!